You could build a pair of these for under $1,000. Only $1,000? All right, I already have all the tools. Okay, so let me rephrase that. So if you have about $2,000 worth of tools already, then yeah, it'll cost you about $1,000 in materials. Tools. So what tools? These tools. So you need a circular saw, a really old hand sander or orbit sander or orbital sander. You're gonna need a plunge router and the router bits. I use this router jig, which you can find on Amazon. Use the drill. Use an impact driver.
And very importantly, the wood glue.
A bunch of wood clamps, because biting multiple pieces of plywood together, you need a bunch of wood clamps to do this. Obviously, things to measure, like a measuring tape, a ruler, a fast square, a miter saw, not a chop saw, a miter saw, that kind of pulls out and cuts, pulls back in, right? Professionals know what I mean when I do this.
This video does not contain professionals of any kind. This video contains a vlogging experience of an average Joe using dangerous woodworking tools in order to save himself thousands of dollars to build himself a hi-fi pair of open baffle speakers. Should you attempt to do this on your own, we strongly recommend you do your homework and learn how to use the tools that are mentioned in this video
so that you don't cut your finger or arm or toe off.
This is important, and this was a disclaimer.
All right, let's start with the summary. So first, the driver I'm using for my build is I'm using Lisong's F15 driver. Second, the baffle is just built with 3/4 inch plywood. I used one sheet of 4 feet by 8 feet long. I cut it into 4 equal sections, and I use a router to cut the holes for the speaker drivers. So these 4 panels, it's 2 panels per baffle. One hole is the size of the inner dimensions of the speaker driver. The other hole is an inch larger in diameter. Then I glue and bind these panels together. Once they're glued together, I use wood putty in the circles to create a semi-smooth, shallow horn. Then I sand the panels down, I stain them, put varnish on them for a base to hold the panels up and to add a little bit of weight to the overall product. I use 3 pieces of 4x4 that I cut at about 20 inches long, bound those 3 together with glue, and use structural wood screws to keep them tight, as well as a metal plate on top of them to help reduce vibration as the wood might dry over time. And I use the same structural wood screws from Outdoor Accents, the 3.5 inches long one, to secure the base onto the baffle at the bottom, as well as a little L-shaped metal bracket in the back to help keep the baffles sturdy onto the base. Now, let's dive in. Okay, so the footage I had from when I cut the first actual piece of plywood, and this is all that's left of it, all came out blurry. So what I'm gonna do is to just illustrate what I did to prep the piece of plywood. I'm gonna use this piece of paper that you're seeing now on screen. So the sheet was 4 feet by 8 feet. You cut all these pieces at the 24-inch mark, so you'll be left with pieces that are 48 inches tall by roughly 23 and a bit, depending on the width of your blade. Little tip, if you're buying a sheet of wood and you don't already have it, at the hardware store, have them do it. They have a machine there, which is far simpler, far more precise, and I don't even think they charge for it if you're buying the sheet there. Once I finish cutting this sheet of plywood into 4 identical pieces, roughly, it's okay. I'll make them identical later on. I stacked them on top of each other and used the wood clamps so that they wouldn't move. Why? Because I wanted to have the jig pilot hole. So this is the hole that the screw for the anchor of the jig sits. So let's say you have the board here, anchor sits in there, you screw it in. Router jig, you can make your own. There's a bunch of videos online to show you how to make router jigs. I just bought this one, which is nice and easy and simple to set the measurements that you want, to cut out a perfect circular hole to put the drivers. So this basically just sits on the anchor. You'd have the router attached to it, and it does cuts a nice perfect circle. While I'm on this, one of the things I learned with the last versions of building open baffles is with an F15 driver, which I'm pretty sure it's roughly the same logic with any driver really. So the lower the driver sits on the baffle, the more the lower mids and upper bass come out. However, it comes at the cost of soundstage depth and transparency of the stereo image. So having it lower on the baffle, meaning I've tried it have the phase plug be at about 25 inches off the bottom. I tried also having it at 18 inches off the bottom, and even a bit lower actually on the first version. So the lower it sits on the baffle, the more lower mids and upper bass you're going to get from the full range driver. The higher you put it on that baffle, like I've put it well over 35 inches high, so it was much higher. So the phase plug actually, when I was sitting down, was over my ears. What this did is it increased the transparency and the depth of a soundstage greatly, and a lot more in the high frequency and the details, but it came at the cost of the lower mids and upper bass, which I always had to compensate with the bass driver. So this time I decided I'm going to make it so that it's roughly at my ear mark. So I set it so that the pilot hole, which is the equivalent of where the face plug in the center of the driver is, was at 30 inches off the ground, which very closely matches the height of my ears, maybe just an inch under when I'm sitting in my sweet spot. And come to think of it, it probably could be even a little bit better. Like if I wanted a little bit more in the mids, I could have brought it down maybe to 27, which I might try in a future version. Yeah, so having that driver at 30 inches off the floor, to me, gives it a better balance of what I want. I still get that beautiful transparency in the soundstage and in the stereo image, but I still get enough of that lower mid-range from the F15 driver, and that way the bass driver won't have to compensate too much.
So let's be real. If you're doing this, fine-tune the height of the driver to what you like. And there's other ways to improve the mid-range if you want to improve the mid-range in the upper bass. Through crossovers, through your bass drivers. Do what you like. If you want a warmer mid-range, lower the driver a little bit. These are just guidelines. Nothing's better, nothing's worse. You can fine-tune it however you like. Drivers and baffles always have a synergy. The driver impacts the baffle, and the baffle impacts the driver. Meaning, the vibrations that the driver creates transmit to the baffle, and the baffle helps project the sound. And the nature of the baffle, the thickness, the size, the surface area, the weight, the material, it's definitely got an influence on the performance of the driver you're using. I wonder if different materials will sound differently.
All right, so I picked the height of the drivers on the baffles. I set them up so that the face plug, so the dead center of the driver, is at 30 inches. So now it's time to cut the holes for the drivers. Now, I'm trying something different with these builds. I wanted to do a shallow horn for the driver. Previously, I would always have them recessed a little bit from the back or completely flush in the front of the baffle. This time I wanted a shallow horn, like a horn of about roughly 2 inches, maybe a bit more than 2 inches. because it's 2 pieces of 3/4 plywood, so it's 1.5. But give it the angle, you have a surface area of about 2 inches and a bit. So to do these horns, I don't have a CNC machine. I didn't have fancy tools, so I decided to go creative a little bit, and I figured that by putting 2 layers of plywood together of 3/4, where the back layer I cut the hole for the inside dimensions of the driver. So a quick tip before you cut to make sure your measurements are good. You look at the dimensions of the driver you're going to use and get the inner dimension. What I mean by the inner dimension is the outer rim where the screw holes are on the driver. Obviously, they have to go into some wood, so that's why you use the inner dimension. So to make sure you measure it properly with your router jig, what you do is from your pilot hole, just measure exactly the radius on both sides of what the hole you're going to cut should be at. So I set one marking here. So in this case, for the F15 driver, it's like 13.99 something inches. So I measured that, having this being the absolute center of the diameter, and have the outer edge of the hole here marked here, outer edge of the hole marked there. And then what you do is your router jig on top, before you start cutting, you bring your cut, because you got to factor in also the diameter of the bit you're using to cut. I mean, you can use smaller ones, you can use bigger ones, and make sure that the outside of this actually lands spot on both sides. If we go down, beautiful. All right.
So to avoid having issues when you get to the end of the cut, because if you don't secure that center piece, once you're done cutting it off the main board, it will start spinning like crazy while that blade is touching it. So I put a piece of wood underneath that the pilot screw drives all the way into as well, which you see here in the video, and make sure that not just the pilot screw goes down to that piece of wood underneath your panel, but that it also is clamped down both to your working bench and to the panel, so nothing moves when you're done cutting.
And the layer on the outside is going to be at least 1 inch larger in diameter. And then I take the router bit, the angled router bit afterwards, and I trim all 4 panels with giving it an angle. So once that was done, then bind the panels together. What matters the most here is that you line up the circles as much as possible, and it creates a little bit of a groove. Like, it's not perfect, obviously. It doesn't have this like a beautiful 45-degree angle all around. There's a little bit of a groove in there, but that's where the wood putty comes in. So you fill in that groove and smooth it out with wood putty. Let it completely cure, let it dry, and then you can sand it down. And that's what I did. It's okay. I didn't worry too much about the fact that now I could see that my panels were a little bit off from each other, that there's a little lip on each side, because once the panels are glued together, then I just grab my router with this bit and go around all the panels, and that simply makes the edges nice and flush. Following that, a ton of sanding. Then it's just a matter of, I decided to go with the walnut stain. Maybe I shouldn't have, whatever, it's okay. I put 7 coats of stain, and then I put 2 coats of varnish. So I wanted it to be a little bit rustic looking too. Like, I didn't want it to be like a piano perfect finish. Couldn't, because the pieces of plywood I picked for this project were actually pieces of plywood that I put down on my driveway when I had dump trucks and backhoes coming to my backyard when I did some landscaping in my yard a couple years ago. So yeah, so they're plywood that have a story, and now they're speakers.
For the base, I just used cedar 4x4s that I cut about 20 inches long and glued all 3 of them together, sanded the tops and bottom down, and put these outdoor accent screws by Simpson ties, the large ones for this case, the 5.5 inch ones. To help make sure that they didn't vibrate also, I also put a little L bracket at the back so that it would add an extra fastening to the baffle, as well as a metal plate that went across all 3 pieces of 4x4, again, to make sure that if ever the wood dries or changes, that it would minimize the vibrations that would potentially come from the space. And then I just used them flat on the bottom and secured them with 3.5-inch Simpson ties outdoor accent screws.
So I was talking about the bass drivers. So how come no bass drivers on these baffles like I did with previous versions? Like I mentioned earlier on, like there's a relationship going on between the baffle and the drivers and vice versa. In all the versions where I had the bass driver, in this case the Lisong W15, sharing the same baffle, so the same material. And this is probably because of the nature and type of wood that I was using. I'm sure if you're using something that is far more vibration resistant, you might get less of this. What I found is as soon as I pair that big bass driver in the same panel as my regular full range, the amount of vibrations that the bass driver was actually creating in the baffle, I think was coming and affecting the full range driver to a degree. In fact, I think it was sucking out a bit of the mid-range from the full range driver. And in my previous versions, that's why I ended up actually cutting the baffle and separating the 2 baffles with rubber gaskets so that they weren't part of the same entity anymore. And actually that did help. It helped actually, it brought a lot of that mid-range back. It also helped bring back that transparency, because I found that when the bass driver shares that same baffle as the full range driver or coaxial or whatever you want, the bass driver has a tendency to take away from some of that magic of the other driver. And actually, I think that for those of you who know of ABX Audiophiles, the YouTube channel, James is really onto something there, because for their bass driver, it's like they're putting their bass driver on a choke collar, on a leash, by porting it in the front. So they're controlling, I think, the amount of bass volume that comes out of that driver, which helps tame the impact on the baffle, which allows the top driver to shine. If you guys are curious about this, I encourage, reach out to ABX Audiophiles. James, what an awesome guy. So I decided to take the bass drivers out of these drivers because I was reminded of the first couple versions of the F15's gorgeous mid-range. I loved it, and it just made a huge image. So I wanted to get back to that. I wanted to get that back, but combine the height, the horn, and I'm still using the bass drivers, but they're in their own baffles behind these new baffles. And with a little bit of playing with adjusting the phase properly, that soundstage got super deep again. I get the great slam from the bass, but I'd say 98% or 95% of the magic that the F15s bring in their own baffles by themselves. So thanks for tuning in. Next time I'm going to make broccoli-shaped baffles. No, really. I am. You know what? Let's go listen to them.